Well, Mr. President, here in Congress, as you know, we do a lot of oversight that's focused on what is going right and also what is going wrong in our government. And there's a lot of each, actually. That oversight is critically important work, sometimes overlooked, but critically important. I think it's also important to stop and recognize where things are going right from time to time, people that are doing the right thing. Following in the footsteps of one of our former colleagues here, I don't think the presiding officer ever had a chance to work with him, but Ted Kaufman was our interim senator. Served here for 2 years. He succeeded Joe Biden, who went off to do some other job. I think vice president, maybe that's what it is. But and then before Senator Chris Coons was elected 2 years later, Ted Kaufman was our senator. Great guy. He used to be Joe's chief of staff for Senator Joe Biden's chief of staff for I think 20 years or so. But Ted used to come to the floor pretty regularly and talk about different federal employees who were doing exemplary work, people who had gone above and beyond to achieve the mission of solving problems and giving the U.S. taxpayers something to be proud of. And when somebody has a good idea, I like to steal it. And I think Ted Kaufman had a great idea. And we've not really stolen it, but we've taken that idea and we've refocused it just a little bit to focus on some of the people that the presiding officer and I, along with Senator Ron Johnson, met with this last weekend on the border, U.S. border with Mexico. And I've decided to take the Ted Kaufman idea and focus it, put a spotlight on a number of employees within the Department of Homeland Security. As many of us know, the Department of Homeland Security, which does important work, sometimes heroic work, dangerous work, they suffer from low morale. But they're filled with men and women who, frankly, punch above their weight and deserve, I think, in many cases, a lot more credit than they receive. Today, I want to talk for the next several minutes about one of the people that we met, and a fellow whose name I think you'll probably remember, Mr. President. And his name is Ramiro Garza Jr., and he goes by Ram. And I think he's probably gone by Ram all his life, and I will always remember him as Ram. But he's an outstanding Border Patrol officer whom we met last week in McAllen, Texas, while we were visiting the Mexican border in South Texas. The three of us, presiding officer, Senator Ron Johnson, and yours truly. This is Ram Garza Jr. Some of you may remember the pictures last summer when an unprecedented surge of Central American children and families arrived at our Texas border. The kind of pictures really kind of burned into your memory for a lot of us. They were, the pictures were really more used to seeing in maybe in war zones than to see here in our own country. But hundreds upon hundreds of unaccompanied minors and a lot of mothers with young children in search of protection, literally turning themselves in to our border agents, not running away from them, but turning themselves in and asking for asylum. The Rio Grande Valley in South Texas is where Agent Garza, where Ram works. And Ram is he's the acting patrol agent in charge of the Rio Grande Valley sector, the U.S. Border Patrol. But and there in the Rio Grande Valley, where Ram works, is the epicenter of that humanitarian crisis that we witnessed last year. That's because most of the migrants were from the northern triangle of Central America, were fleeing violence, fleeing economic desperation, fleeing a sense of hopelessness in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador. These migrants had to travel some 1,500 miles through Mexico, risking life and limb to get to the U.S. The shortest route, though by no means an easy one, runs up the east side of Mexico from Central America to the South Texas border. Many of the people who are coming up, making that 1,500-mile trek, did it on top of a train. In fact, there's a series of trains, freight trains, not passenger trains, freight trains, where people actually get on top of the trains and try to hold on for a 1,500-mile trip. Some of them succeeded, some of them didn't. Some of them fell down between the trains, the cars, and lost their lives. Some made it to the border. Some fell off the train. Some got hurt. Some got on another train. Some didn't make it. But many rode on top of those trains to get here, and they suffered violence. If they made it safely on the train, a lot of them suffered violence at the hands of predatory gangs along the way. When these children showed up in South Texas, they literally overwhelmed the Border Patrol stations along the border. These stations are only supposed to hold detained migrants for a very short period of time as they are processed either for removal back to wherever they came from or for detention. Usually they deal along the border, they deal with the young men. However, last year, stations were packed with mothers and young children who were trapped there for days as our government struggled to find suitable shelters and decide what to do with them. There are no adequate meals, no clothing, no diapers. There's literally no room at times for someone to lie down either. And faced with this human crisis, Customs and Border Protection agents sprang into action. And among their leaders was our agent here today that I want to especially put a spotlight on, Ramiro Garza. And with help from his colleagues, Ram went above and beyond to process the arrivals according to the law, while also responding to the human needs of these people. Agent Garza helped create an emergency operations center to manage the crisis and work to transfer unaccompanied children to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Perhaps most impressive, though, he worked with his colleagues to convert an enormous abandoned warehouse that we visited in McAllen, Texas. I will not soon forget that. It's just a few miles from our border with Mexico. And he turned it into a processing center for the detained migrants, and they did it in 18 days. You look at a place, and they described what it was like before they started working on it, and you looked at it, what they did in 18 days. You got to say it's pretty remarkable stuff, and the fellow that we honor, especially here today, and those that work with him, we think they have deserved this kind of recognition. Well, this processing center helped greatly relieve the crowded and inadequate conditions in multiple Border Patrol stations along the border. And when Senator Johnson, our presiding officer, Senator Sass, and I visited this past weekend the extraordinary processing center that Agent Garza helped to set up, we were amazed to see a cavernous, orderly center equipped with humanitarian necessities needed for hundreds of children and their parents. And the center also had space for Central American officials to work with Customs and Border Protection in order to properly identify migrants and arrange for speedier repatriations in many cases to their home countries where appropriate. Agent Garza was instrumental in designing the processing facility and getting it up and running quickly. Today, he's in charge of that facility. It's just the latest achievement in Agent Ramiro Garza's career with the Border Patrol. And as I said, known most of his life as Ram, Agent Garza grew up in the Rio Grande Valley. And there he attended high school and the University of Texas Pan American. He joined the Border Patrol in 1996. His first assignment was the Brownsville station there in the Rio Grande sector. And in 2004, he was promoted to supervisory Border Patrol agent at the Rio Grande City Station. And that was followed by tours at the Rio Grande Sector's Intelligence Office and Harlingen Station. Agent Garza has also worked on detail here in Washington, D.C., where his duties included supporting the agent's efforts in biometric collection, something we think is very important. And while he's helping to humanely process migrants apprehended at the border, Agent Garza also cares for his own family, his wife and their own 2 children. We thank them for sharing with us their husband and their dad. Very good man. The Department of Homeland Security and our nation are truly blessed by Ram's exemplary service. Agent Garza, if you're out there listening, we want to thank you. We want to thank you for what you do each and every day for all of us. We thank you for your tireless service to our nation for all these years. And Mr. President, as you and I met, along with Senator Johnson, we met the men and women of the Border Patrol last weekend, including Agent Garza. We heard about their work. It's hard to ignore the fact that they might not know if they'll be getting a paycheck next month when the continuing resolution, which funds the Department of Homeland Security, expires in, about 2 weeks, on February 27th. Many of them don't know if they'll be able to obtain the technology or supplies they need to do their jobs as effectively as possible either. And it's not the way we would want to be treated if we're in their shoes, but it's how I think we're treating the men and women who work around the clock to protect our borders and to keep our nation safe and secure. Those of us here in Congress can change that, and I think we should. 2 of our colleagues, Senator Jean Shaheen, New Hampshire, Barbara Mikulski, Maryland, have introduced a clean appropriations bill that would fund the Department of Homeland Security for the balance of this fiscal year up through the end of September. Overall, the funding provisions of their bill, it's S-272, which I understand both Democrats and Republicans on the Appropriations Committee agreed to just this past December, 2 months ago, we provide just under $40 billion in discretionary funding for the Department of Homeland Security for the remainder of the fiscal year. That's an increase, I think, from year to year of about $400 million. Sounds like a lot of money. It's about 1% increase above the 2014 funding. But this bill would ensure that department employees get their paychecks on time and have the resources that they need to best meet the department's critical missions and the security needs of our nation. The clean bill put forward by Senator Shaheen and Mikulski would take additional measures to secure our border and to enforce our immigration laws, something I know is a priority to me and I know to our colleagues on both sides of the aisle. In fact, most of the funding increase in the Shaheen-Mikulski bill would go to border security and immigration enforcement. The bill our colleagues have put forward contains a little more than $10 million for Customs and Border Protection, an increase of approximately $118 million above last year's enacted level. And this funding level would support the largest operational force levels for the agency in its history, a total of more than 21,000 Border Patrol agents and nearly 24,000 enforcement officers. But if the Department of Homeland Security remains on a continuing resolution, or worse, shuts down, we just won't be as effective as we ought to be in securing our nation's borders. If Congress forces a shutdown of the department, I hope we won't, but frontline personnel, as I mentioned, would be asked to continue to work without pay. Here's some of them we met just a few days ago when we were on the border. They don't look like fast boats, and they move pretty good, don't they? And we went zipping up and down the Rio Grande River, looking for people trying to slip across the border, looking for folks who are trying to bring contraband drugs, illegal drugs across the border. But there's some 40,000 Customs and Border Protection officers that we're needed to keep our borders secure. And if we allow the funding for the department to lapse on February 27th, we're going to expect these guys and gals to still come to work. We're just not going to pay them, at least not in a timely way. If Congress continues to keep the department on a continuing resolution, Immigration and Customs Enforcement will see a shortfall, I'm told, of over $500 million to respond to unaccompanied minors and families with children. In addition, Customs and Border Protection won't be able to replace or upgrade border surveillance technology, including upgrades to obsolete remote and mobile video surveillance systems in the high-risk area of the Rio Grande Valley. This is a drone, is a pilot, this aircraft that we fly them, aircraft similar to these all over the planet. But we fly a number of them along the borders of our country with Mexico in an effort to try to see, visualize, detect people making their way to our borders, maybe just to come across, maybe to flee the bad situation in their own country. Maybe it's to bring drugs or other things that are illegal into our country. But we're not going to be able to replace or upgrade this kind of technology. And to bring it to high-risk areas along the Rio Grande Valley. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson recently said, and I want to quote Secretary Johnson just briefly. He said, "Border security is not free." He said, the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security need a partner in Congress to fund their efforts. And he added that time is running out. Those are his words. And I just couldn't agree with him more. And the next week or so, I pray that those of us in Congress will come together and we'll do what I believe is the right thing, and that is to support the passage of a clean, full-year appropriations bill for the remainder of this fiscal year for the Department of Homeland Security. That we'll do it by February 27th. And after we've done that, for God's sake, let's get to work on crafting a thoughtful, comprehensive, bipartisan immigration reform law for our country. One that better secures our borders, one that strengthens our economy, and one that reduces our budget deficits over the next 2 decades by literally like hundreds of billions of dollars. That's what we ought to do. And I would just pledge here today to my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, 1 or 2 independents, our presiding officer, that I'm ready to meet you in the middle and to do our dead level best to make sure we meet our responsibilities.